My name is Mykhailova, and I'm a web developer with Digital Echidna, which is a full-service agency that is located in London, Ontario. We are all the way up north in Canada, and it's freezing cold in there, so I'm really enjoying the weather here. I'm still wearing a jacket, can't believe it can be warm. Yeah, the other day I looked up the bright yellow circle in the sky. Apparently didn't know what it was, googled it, it's called sun. So I'm very happy to see it, and I'm very happy to be here. So today we will be covering a lot of large-scale recurring imports, and that's the part when you need to import a huge amount of data into your website on a constant periodic basis. Before we do that, we need to figure out why do we need a custom import. As you all probably know, there is a great framework in Drupal core that is Migrate, and it's amazing. It's a huge ecosystem that is evolving every single day, so why would we ever need an import? That's a great question, and the point for it is that Migrate is amazing and it's very robust, but sometimes you just need something more lightweight and recurring. And by recurring, I mean, I have clients that would need to import a big portion of data every minute or every 2 hours or every day, and you can't just run migrations all the time, mostly because it might have some problems of, you have to have a developer who would run dash commands, or you have to train editors how to run it through UI, but then develop a custom UI for that. So Migrate is great to, migrating your stuff from Drupal to Drupal, or from a legacy site to Drupal on like one basis, or maybe run it one more time before lunch. But if you have to import some sort of information on a daily basis, you probably need to go custom, because you don't want to resave the entire node. You might want to update just the value of 1 or 2 fields. Let's say you're doing import for continuous education courses for university, and they all have like intake status and amount of spaces available. So you would like this sensitive information to be imported on, let's say, hourly basis. So definitely you don't want to run the huge migration or to just update the amount of spaces available. You also don't want to make your editor to edit 1,000 plus courses to present the information to the users. So you would like to be able to connect to the university or college system that provides and holds this information from registrar office and import it into Drupal. So that would be one use case. The other use case would be like you're in a hospital and you would like to monitor vaccination bookings. So, and then present this information on the public website. So then you would connect to the hospital internet and get the information from there. So custom imports can allow you to update what needs to be updated, so 1 field, 2 fields, and it doesn't have to always delete the nodes. It can also publish and publish them, and easier integrate with something like workbench moderation or content moderation, and have other states. So for example, if you use an elaborate editor workflow as like draft, ready to publish, ready for review, you can set these states instead of just publish and publish delete that Migrate does out of the box. And it's easy to scale, because if you write the system that we will be discussing today, it will be easier to scale, because this system is focused on minimal server resources while processing a huge amounts of data. So in our projects, we tested it with around 500,000 nodes, and I'm pretty sure that it's scalable even further with the right setup. Alright, so we want to start our journey, but before we start our journey, how many of you in the room are backend developers? Okay, front-end developers, site builders, content editors? Nobody, okay. So that's a little bit of a backend developer focused task, but it covers all of the concepts. So people who are not very familiar with object-oriented programming, don't worry. We will be covering the concepts and tips and foundations, so you don't feel out of place. So first of all, every single import journey starts with your requirements. And it's very important. And when you're gathering your requirements, you need to engage the client into this process. And the better you gather your requirements, the better the final product will be. So you need to sit down with the client, or preferably with client and client IT team, and ask them, do they want periodic or one-time import? And by that I mean, most of the clients usually say, oh, we want a one-time thing. We just want to import this, collection of bills into our system in Drupal, and then we will be doing it manually. And that might be a great answer, but ask a little bit further. Ask how many bills they have on a daily basis. And if the answer is, oh, we have around 500, and like, do you want to present the future bills in your system? And the answer is typically yes. And you say, do you want the editor to be engaged on a 7 hours task of updating the bills? And the answer is probably no. So in order to avoid that, the answer would be they want a periodic import. The key part of this is not all of the clients know immediately out of the box that they want a periodic import. The second question to ask is, it needs to be manual or it needs to be automated? And by that I mean, if it's manual, you would like an editor or a trained person, a developer, whoever happens to be on the client side or on your side, to manually press the button and run the import. So that's good if you, for example, run a huge update of a content on quarterly basis. Let's say you release financial information about funds and financial products your company sells, and it updates quarterly. Then it's all right to run a manual import. So you are ready with all of your information, you update it on your system, you press the button, you import it in Drupal, you create, everything is great. If you have something more periodic, like let's say daily, or we have some clients that run imports every 30 seconds, and obviously you don't want to have a person to sit and press button every 30 seconds, because this person will probably go crazy very fast. So then you will have to ask, do you want a cron job or continuous integration? So what's the difference between cron job and continuous integration? Has anybody ever used continuous integration tools? Yeah? So continuous integration is something that basically does a job for you. It's a third-party tool that automates a task on your side outside of Drupal. And the difference between cron and continuous integration is continuous integration tools is like cron on steroids. It can do everything cron can, plus a little bit more. And we will cover why continuous integration better than cron a little bit later. And you have to think about the architecture. So usually a client comes in and says, I would like to import this type of data into Drupal. That sounds like a one content type. So you say, all right, that's great. However, as soon as you imported the data, they say, oh, we would like to organize it into views. We would like to also group it by users that imported it. Or we would like to be able to add some taxonomies and categorize it. So you see how quickly it grew out of one content type into multiple content type, probably with entity references and taxonomy term references. And it just grew out of proportion. So before you start even building your import, because import is easier to build from the beginning, but harder to update. You have to monitor your machine names, you have to add content types, and it's just not very nice when you come back a few months later and try to plug in a different content type in, and you just have to browse through this huge amount of fields, and it's really difficult to remember what function was doing what. So it's way better to architect it from the beginning, this potential growth, than just do one flat import and then build something on top of it a few months later. So think about how many content types and how they will be connected. So never start your import before your site building. The site building needs to be done, and the content types need to be tested before you start the import. And by tested, I mean add some test content. show it to the user, and it doesn't have to be styled, but ask the client, is it everything that they would like to present? So let's say, does it have ability to add PDFs? Does it have ability to add images? And do they want to ever bring images or PDFs automatically? So you have to have this discussion before you even start building your import. The second architecture piece is a class hierarchy. And by class hierarchy, I mean hierarchy of your code. When you build an import, and when I built my first import, it was a huge mess. I'm not proud of the code at all. And the problem was I didn't organize it. I didn't know what I was doing, and I just mashed everything together. It was in Drupal 7, and I mashed everything together in procedural style, like a gigantic 8,000 lines of code file. And yeah, it's just like whenever I have to edit or change anything in there, it's just a nightmare task that I push as much further as I can. So think about your class hierarchy and class architecture. It's good to build a good object-oriented pattern where you can reuse as much as possible throughout your import queues. So have a base class and inherit and extend from it. And we will cover that also today. And think about your sources. Sources is the crucial part, and you would think, why is it? Because you have to talk to your client and figure out what it is they want to import from. And it seems like an easy and obvious question, but there are some tricks into it. Is it always going to be just that source, or is it going to be something different as well? Is it going to be just from one source or from multiple? Is it in the future there is a potential to add way more sources into your ecosystem? And how all of the sources will be working together? All of these questions is important to ask before you even start thinking about building an import. So what are your options? Well, the easiest and the simplest option is the manual import. It's when you will build a simple configuration form and you will press a button and the import runs through Drupal UI. Very easy to build and nothing special there. A step further is a cron job. So cron is great. It does so many things for you. However, there are limitations. On some of the hosting, especially on the cheaper plans, you will have a hard limit on how long the cron job can run. So let's say you are importing 50,000 items on the cron job, and the cron job can only run for 3 minutes. Well, obviously, your 50,000 items will not be processed in this time. Not because your code is not optimized, but also because cron is responsible for so many other tasks that nobody guarantees your ultimate priority, right? So you can also put a separate cron thread and stuff like that, but not all hosting allow that. Some hostings have really strict requirements of what can be done and what cannot with cron. So you also don't want to overload your server with this huge cron job that's running around the ground of your server, and especially when Drupal really relies on other cron tasks, like cache clearing, rebuilding stuff, and everything like that. You really don't want to overload cron. Also with cron, on some hostings, you can't guarantee that the cron runs. The site can go just like, to sleep, and the cron didn't run. And you can't guarantee when the import finishes. And if you have some time-sensitive data, like let's say vaccination bookings, you would like to have it updated, and you have to guarantee to the user that it will be updated by X hour in the day. So if you have these problems, then into stage steps out a continuous integration tool. I use Jenkins. There is Travis. There are so many options. You can use GitLab CI for that. Anything that can run drush commands, that will work. And I'm nowhere in professional Jenkins. All I do is make him run my drush commands on basically a timetable, and that's it. But it's great. And what is great about Jenkins is that it can run it until it succeeds. So it will fail, it will rerun it, and fail, rerun it. So you can always guarantee that the job will run no matter what. The other advantage is it's outside of Drupal. It basically doesn't care about what cron is doing. It will always run in a certain time. It's irrelevant to the server, and it's basically just tells the Drupal to run the dash command and get the replies back. So everything, any tool that can run like command line scripts will work for you in this matter. So the sources. The easiest scenario is when you have your file sources put into Drupal folder. And the easiest way is you talk to your IT team from the client and say, hey, can you just drop it manually like once in quarter and then click this button and the import runs. This is the simplest scenario, probably you will never get it. Then the second one is automated drop by your client IT. That's the second simplest on the developer scenario. So that means that the IT person will have their system to export files in some sort of a format like JSON, CSV, XML that's discussed with you, and it will automatically drop it by a certain period of time. Then cron or Jenkins will pick it up and import into Drupal. And the worst scenario is when you have to manually connect to some sort of an external feed, an external database, or external file server. This is where the development nightmare begins. Usually is when external feed is not protected by any sort of password and username. It's all good, you can still consume it. The problem starts when the feed is too big and you have to handle pagination and all of the requests yourself and failures of the API yourself. External DB brings other problems. Do you have a driver? Does Drupal support this driver? How would you connect? Is it the database server behind the firewall? So all of these questions also needs to be asked by IT, and if you can, try to avoid these direct connections to their databases. And the reason for that is you don't want to be responsible for their internal servers. They have a team for that, and if something goes wrong, even though you do in select queries, it will be really hard to prove that you haven't trashed their database. And usually these databases that are working internally for hospitals, government, associations, they have sensitive client information. You really don't want to accidentally query something that shouldn't be on the public site and expose it to the entire world. So it's preferable to work together with the IT team to either have a set of pre-selected queries that they supply to you, or ask them to export it out into some sort of a format that you can consume. So like JSON or CSV file. Then they're responsible for the data they provide to you. You're only responsible for the import and putting it into Drupal. So you know, no matter what's coming in the data, you didn't get the responsibility for exposing public information. The IT gave you the data and you assume that it's correct data. And external file server, it's an easier one, but you may need a library that can allow you connection to the SFTP versus FTP access. When that's done and you determined your sources, you talked about how often the import should run, it's time to talk about architecture. And in our world, everything starts with structure and with foundation. So first is very easy, it's talk about content types and its structure. So think about fields. Think about if the fields are required or they are multi-value, do you have to write any special field formatters to hold the information, or do you have to have any special modules like paragraphs or field collections? Do you have to do related taxonomies? Is your site multilingual? Make sure that the information you're getting is good for translation and the fields are translatable. And at the end, if none of this matches, maybe you should write a custom entity. And why would you write a custom entity? So imagine the situation when you have a record, let's say it's prices record for some sort of a book, and it has a lot of fields. It has inventory number for the book, it has book description, authors, marketing value, prices value, and all those sorts of stuff. So like, let's say 50 fields on this content type. You can definitely build it as a content type, there is no problem, but you don't have any text information. And that means you only have numbers. Think about, do you really want the content type? with all of the fields, every time you will query this data, you will have to have these multiple joins because every single field table in Drupal is a Drupal database table. Or you can have a custom entity where all your 50 fields are in one table. And they don't have to be translatable. Even if all of your content types are translatable, this one doesn't because it's just numbers. And you basically eliminate the bloating of the database and you just store it separately, and it's a lot of records. Another advantage that you get is when you query your node table, this one doesn't step into the way. So we had a client that was storing 10 years of archived data for such entity. And basically what would happen if I had 500,000 records and growing every day, my node table would just become unprocessable. That means that it will affect the performance for the entire site, even though it doesn't really have to be in a node table. So then a custom entity is your choice. And don't be worried about the custom entity. Drupal console has an amazing command to just generate in that. And it starts with a great template, and you can just customize it, and it's very easy to get, and it's just plug and play in Drupal 8 practically. And second piece of the architecture is your file or feed structure. So this time you dive a little bit deeper. You already defined the format, but what you need to define is fields in this feed or file. So if you have CSV files, it's your column names. You need to communicate with your IT and convey a message that it needs to be set in stone. And by that I mean, if they one day decide to add another column, that probably will break the import. If they decide to add a column, that column will not automatically become part of Drupal. The problem that we are facing on a day-to-day basis as developers is that import acts like sort of magic, and with some time of using it, editors get so used to having it all automated that they forget that if they change the CSV file, it will not automatically become better with this extra column. You actually have to have a development work to be done behind the scene to accommodate this column. But that thin line, it just becomes invisible with the time because they are so excited they don't have to do it manually, they just believe it will just work. So they start getting a little bit creative in terms of how to change the structure of the file without telling you. So you need to communicate that it needs to be set in stone. And formatting and encoding. So Drupal really, and any PHP application really hates any other encoding than UTF-8. And it's really hard to communicate that UTF-16 is not UTF-8. And Unicode is not UTF-8, and you really need UTF-8. And every time it's not UTF-8, you have to do something, some sort of a processing, use an external library to make it UTF-8, and it will never be perfect. So this is the most part of your back and forth with IT team, because when you get in your import and you feel like it's perfect, and then you see it in Drupal path and all your characters, special characters are broken, especially if you have multilingual site, this is a sensitive part that needs to be basically worked together with the IT team to get the right encoding. And the second one is a format. And the common mistake is, if you're using a CSV file, is use comma as a delimiter. And I know that you can have escape characters, you can have text encoded in double quotes and everything, but when you run huge amount of data on a daily basis, this just doesn't work. It's very easy to make a mistake and make it so the double quotes is not escaped, or something just goes wrong and all of your data is just broken up. And then the comma didn't get escape inside the text, and it's just an error that is really hard to get. So in order to avoid that, talk to your IT team, if it's possible, to get some sort of very special delimiter that definitely is not going to happen in your file. So let's say a pipe or in combination of a characters, that definitely is not going to happen. So then you know for sure that if there is a pipe, it's a delimiter. And I use a couple of libraries to parse CSVs, like leak CSV is a very good one, but you can always just use like PHP default methods to parse CSV. As soon as you just have these special delimiters, you're on the safe side. And get access credentials early. The biggest part of it, import is really hard to debug whenever you actually already developed it. So the situation you may run into is when you developed everything on your local environment or your dev environment, and it's just amazing, everything runs perfectly, you see the data importing, everything is great, and you finally move it into production, the import runs, you don't see any errors, anything, and you don't see any data. And the reason for that might be that now you're reading from a different server, and the server needs credentials, and whenever the file is just didn't get through, the Drupal couldn't read the file, it will silently continue without telling you that it failed to load the file. Because obviously on a production environment, you will switch off the error notification, and an error level will be way lower than the one that is reported in your local on your dev environment, and you just can't access the server. So try work with real access credentials as early as possible, so you can eliminate this problem when you're basically testing on a couple fields versus when you are actually having 50 fields already developed and then nothing is imported in. Finding the right key. So it's basically a key to your data. So determine how you will access the data and what tools you will need to parse the data. So sometimes when you're working with big organizations that still might be using legacy software, let's say they're using like all the XML feed or some sort of other structured field, it might be difficult to parse it out, right? So in order to parse it, you may use external libraries. I recommend the QueryPass library. This is a very good library that it's basically jQuery in PHP. What it allows you to do is allows you to query HTML and XML as if you were querying a jQuery. So you just basically do exactly the same selectors like classes and IDs, and you can get the text of the field, you can modify the HTML, and you can modify XML without having to write XPath queries and working with XML as an XML object that can be tedious if you have a lot of nested fields. So in order to avoid that, use QueryPass, easy to install with Composer, and you're good to go. Encoding is another great library. It allows you to convert almost anything from basically encoding to UTF-8. It has some problems sometimes for some special encodings, but for the most part, it will clean up your encoding and turn it into UTF-8. Try to use it as your last resort, because if you can always talk to your IT to try to provide you with UTF-8 to begin with. If you absolutely can't, that could be a great library as well. Also can be installed through Composer. Curl. It's a funny story how many servers nowadays doesn't come pre-configured with some essential modules. If your client insists on hosting themselves, ask the server specialist if they have all of the modules, and especially if they have curl. It's so many times I had a situation when everything running just perfectly on our server, we brought it to the client server, nothing is working because there is no curl extension. And ask about special permissions. So if you are importing, you don't have to always import into Drupal. You might import into YAML, or you might import into JSON and then use it in the views later on, or maybe use it in your outside apps, like mobile apps, as JSON feed and JSON endpoints. So ask about special permissions to write to the server, and what folders are keeping persistent. So for example, on some of the cloud hostings, you might have that the URLs for public files folder or for the private folder is switching based on the container operating, and your batch or your queue is just failing to write to a consistent spot, and then you just basically can't access these results anymore. So ask about what folder to use and how to keep it persistent. Is there any special setting in your settings PHP that you need to put in before you start? Foundation of the import. So we covered all of the prerequisites, and we are finally ready to build our import. So the foundation of import is very easy. There are only 3 steps you need to cover. First, get the data. Second, parse the data. And third, save the data. It's very simple, right? What can go wrong? A lot. The first problem you will get is time of the import. And as we already talked about, time is very crucial and it's very sensitive for the import. And it's the time of your job. So if you have a lot of data, it's important that you have some sort of a lossless mechanism in place to be able to pick up where the job finished and continue. So we'll cover how to do that. And your server resources. Your server can be busy at a certain point of a day. Let's say you're on an internet site and all of the users come in and log their times at the end of the day. So definitely you don't want to run the import at the same time, because the server is already busy with all of the users of organizations and you don't want to load it even more. So we will start the import with 3 queues. There will be, first queue is that the getting the data. Then we will get a getter queue that is basically parsing the data. And third queue will be a setter queue that basically saves the data into Drupal. So let's stop a little bit on that. Why queues and why 3 queues? So the point for that is, if you use queues API in Drupal, it means that every single item, like every single row of your file, will be always processed continuously. So first it will be get in, then it will be parsed, and then it will be saved. But multiple items of your CSV can go in parallel. So if you have additional server resources to install your Jenkins, you can actually run multiple items as a parallel processes, while none of one items will ever be dropped in the middle. And why is that? Because there are 3 steps, and until a first queue item populates the second queue items, and the second queue item populates the third one, it will never be dropped or broken. So you never store the huge amount of data in your memory. You always store just a small piece of data in your memory. So the first queue, it's very easy. All you need to do is just get the URLs of your resources, or basically a huge blob of resources, but not into the memory, into Drupal database, in the Drupal queue item. So for example, you have 3 files, let's say courses, programs, and student groups. All of that has a huge amount of data in them. You have 3 of these files. In your first queue call, it will be very short. Either get into the URLs of these files, and each queue item will be URL of this file, so you will have 3 queue items, or get a blob out of these files. And it depends on basically how big the files are. If the files are really, really big, don't do it. Just store the URL. If the files is measurable, like around 10 megabytes measurable, you can get the blob and store it into Drupal database. Then you have 3 items. Let's say you stored the blob. So you have 3 huge blobs. Don't care about them. Whenever a server has the resources, it will actually populate the getter queue. So what will happen is the first queue item will get processed. And when it gets processed, it will just split this huge blob into rows. So let's say you had 500 records in your courses file, you will have 500 getter items. Then you'll have 800 records in your programs files. You will get 800 more getter rows. And then you will get like 300 more of students. So your getter queue is a gigantic queue of items, and the ordering them should be like if your students depend on courses and programs, parent content types should be imported first. So you first create the nodes you want to link to, and then the nodes that will be created and linked from. So students link to programs, you create programs first, and you link students to programs after. How to achieve that? Well, it's a queue. Queue is linear. It means that first items will go first, and first come, first served, right? So you never go wrong. Just think about what content type should go first, and in your first queue, get these URLs in that order. After you process, you have these 1,000 something items. Forget about them. When you have resources on your server, the server will grab each item of a getter queue, parse it into fields, and save it into Drupal. It means that every single time, at every single point, you just do a very small, very short operation on your memory in the server, just like node saving. And we all know that usually it's just milliseconds, and you don't even use the browser, so it means that it's just going directly into the database, and it means that it's very fast, and nobody will ever notice. If your server doesn't have resources, it will just stop, and it will get into the queue when it has resources. So if you're on cron, and your cron stopped running, the rest of the queue items will just wait until cron runs again, and it will pick up other batch of queue items, and then again, and it will pick up another batch. So you will never lose the data, because first, all of your first few items will be processed, and it will create getter queue, and only getter queue will populate the setter queue. So see how it's going into the continuous. You get in the data, you parsing it, and you saving it, versus actually dropping it or clicking in the middle. And you will never create a broken item, because you always get to the setter queue, to the final state when you're actually saving. You get into all your parsed information ready for node to consume. So you already have it, and you know for sure that you got the data from a source, and it got processed, and now it's parsed and ready for you to consume. So if it fails in the middle, you can have your catch-try mechanisms to actually log Drupal errors and have a report for editors or whoever it is. And then another problem is, if your queue item process fails, it doesn't break the entire server and doesn't break the entire job. It just breaks this queue item, it is marked as broken, and it's skipped, and you can log it. But all of the rest items will go correctly. So let's say you got some sort of encoding issue on one of your rows of a CSV. Whenever you actually run that, the only one row with encoding issues will fail. All the rest will go just fine. So you practically have an almost lossless import, versus actually having it all as a big batch in the memory, and then when something fails, nothing goes further, because that just hard stops at the fail. So how do we achieve that? Think about the trigger, and the first one is a custom form, as we talked. All you need to do on this form processing is basically populate the first queue. So get the 3, 4, 5, 10 items into the queue records. That's very easy, very light information. And then after that, you get like, on the custom form you run batch API if you have too many items to store in your queue, and that's it. You forget on it. Then you switch to the background job, and on background you either have a cron job that will pick up your 2 other queues, or it will be a draft command that will also just pick up and process items of the queue. So I meshed 2 files together here. Obviously they're not in one file, but just for the slide purposes. So these are 2 different triggers. One is configuration, and you can see that is very simple. It's basically a simple config form. You extend it from configuration form based from core, and you just will have a submit form handler. And in here, you can set some specific configuration options. So let's say you can say, I would like to run the import overnight, Or you can even allow editors to populate your feeds URLs if they are changing. And then you save this configuration, and you can get it when you're actually populating the queue. And then you have import data queue populate, where you parse these configuration options or get the data from the curl request and you store it into the queue. Or you can just define a dash command, which is nothing different from Drupal 7, and you just basically have your dash command with some arguments. The one thing to keep in mind is if you run in your files from your local Drupal installation from public files path, you always need to pass the domain, because on some servers you might have problems because the URL will go to root versus like normal public, like Drupal based URL plus public files URL. So pass the domain so you can prepend it to your path. After that, import get base processing item. So it will basically, in the process item, you will get your blob that was saved on the first step, and you parse this blob and you populate your setup queue. And I love Drupal 8 because you can actually go all the way object-oriented. And notice here, I actually didn't delete the code from import get base, like for import get cron and import get manual. These classes, in the simplest scenario, they will stay empty. And the cool part about it is all your code will go in your base class. It means that you will ever change it just once. So you want to make an update, you change it in here. But you have two plugins to work with. So you can have a queue that is populated on the cron run, or you need to run an emergency import. So you can use the manual one and the manually processed queue. And you have two plugins that are using this base class, and you don't have to do any extra work for it. You just use the one code base, so you never have to track your changes on the multiple steps. And the save base, it just grabs your previous one and then processes it and then saves it to Drupal. And again, the same kind of scenario. You have your base class and you extend it to save base and to manual and cron. And the cool part about it is, let's say your cron queue needs to parse another additional field. You can do it in here. So you can still customize it if you need to, but you don't have to. And this pretty much it. That concludes all three steps, and that will allow you to build a very robust and scalable system. Questions? Yeah.
Is there a module for that? I mean, are there contrib solutions in Drupal 8 that are for people who are quite so advanced?
I was thinking about the module, but the problem is then when it comes to UI configuration, I'm really struggling. Like, it's very easy to release as a boilerplate. It's really hard to release as a full-blown contrib, because I am struggling to customize it well enough for UI configuration and like for site builders to use. It would be great, but I couldn't come up with a solution to make it. Like, I don't want to make it as full-blown as Migrate framework because we already have it, right? So I want to keep it lightweight. So it's really hard to release as contrib, unfortunately. Any other questions? Yeah.
I've run into a situation where the source data, like files, not the fields, but like actual files, PDFs, whatever, are on the customer site, but they're behind a firewall. And due to reasons they can't be exposed to the Drupal site that's trying to import the items. Do you have any recommendations for the best way to grab those assets during the import process?
Yeah, so you can specify in Coral, you can specify, like, you need two steps. First, you need to whitelist the IP the curl or CI job is going to run. That's first. And second, you can specify password and username in your curl request and pass that. So if your IT can collaborate with you on whitelisting the IP and passing username and password, then you can grab the files.
Do you have any suggestions if that's not a possibility? If you have to get the assets out, and then, the only thing I came up with was to store them in a temporary location.
Yeah, you could do. Yeah, we did that too. So basically, if the automation from your client side can just drop it in a temp folder, and then you import when it's processed, delete the files, and if your client can live with that, that's a possibility too, but I don't think you can just magically like get them out.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Have you ever looked at doing custom entities with an API backend so that you don't have to do imports? You just hit an API and get the data that you're looking for?
Yeah, you can. The only problem with that is like you still have to kind of save them, or if you don't save them and just like show them as an API, there is a problem that if your API endpoint, whatever you're using, ever shuts off, the Drupal site looks really bad, right?
Yeah.
So I always recommend the clients to bring it into Drupal just to, to separate it as much as possible. Even if we had a solution that we were using API backend for entities, but then at night time, it will actually bring it into Drupal. So all the new ones will be shown as an API, very fast, very reliable, but the archive will be still stored into Drupal overnight, and it will just check if there is an ID in Drupal. It will use Drupal copy, and if it's an ID from the API, it will use the API one. So then, if ever shut off, you just missing some, newer items, but it's not looking broken for the customer. So it depends on how sensitive the information are.
Right.
Yeah. You have a question? Yeah.
Yeah. Whenever you were talking about reoccurring, I assumed that you meant that you were updating and getting new items every night. But what about the items that are missing that need to be deleted? Is there a step for removing?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's all actually depends on your feed, right? But you need to have a marker or a flag on your feed that actually tell insert, update, deleted. Or just like you need to have a mechanism. So let's say you agree with your client that whatever is missing from the feed, so that the feed is full at all times. So whatever is missing from the feed needs to be either unpublished or deleted from Drupal. So then you handle that in the getter queue or in the setter queue. You just check if the ID is, if unique ID from the feed matches the Drupal. If it is, you updating. If it's not, you deleting. But I don't recommend this solution because if you have a huge archive, obviously you don't want to process all of that overnight. So the best solution is to provide the only items that need to be updated or deleted or created new ones with the flags. So usually we recommend to the IT to add a column that says status and has update, delete, or insert and use from there. But if that's not possible, you can always just rely on unique IDs and tell, okay, I will wipe out all of the items that don't present in this particular file. Any other questions? Yeah.
Along the lines of like boilerplate code, do you have any light examples of?
I have a blog on my company blog that actually has more like boilerplate code explained and with code snippets. So I can link it out from this presentation along with slides, and you can use later.
Okay, great, thank you.
Any other questions, requests, comments? No? Well, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it.